Thank you so much for joining Gwinnett County Public Library for our How to Manage Your Mental Health During COVID program. My name is Miriam Mayer, and I work for Gwinnett County Public Library Adult Services Department. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for tonight. Mazzy Robinson is a licensed professional counselor and speaker specializing in helping women discover their true voice as they navigate self-worth, self-esteem challenges, relationship concerns, and life stage transitions. In addition to her work as a therapist, Mazzy maintains an active speaking schedule, presenting workshops on topics such as anxiety, healing, self-worth, healthy relationships, personal growth, and purposeful living. She is also a certified Daring Way facilitator, presenting workshops and retreats based on the research and methodology of Dr. Brené Brown to individuals and groups. Mazzy is the founder and director of Cultivate. Through its counseling center and bi-monthly gatherings, Cultivate encourages women to cultivate joy, courage, and freedom in their lives as they pursue emotional, mental, and spiritual health. Mazzy resides in Atlanta, Georgia, with her husband and 2 sons. She is an avid Friends fan and loves dinner on a porch with friends. Everyone, please welcome Mazzy Robinson.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Thank you for taking time out of your week to join us. I so appreciate your being here. I hope you've been enjoying the nice weather we've been having in Atlanta. I know even during a pandemic, sunshine and warm days and low humidity feel like a gift. So I hope you've been able to get outside and enjoy that. You know, it is mind-blowing when you think about it that we are coming up on month 14 of COVID living, of global pandemic living. You know, if you were anything like me, when this started in March of 2020, you thought, oh my goodness, this is going to be 2 weeks. How are we going to survive this 2 weeks? How is school going to be closed for 2 weeks, and stores and businesses? And 2 weeks just seemed like forever. And here we are 14 months, almost 14 months later. And I think that shows, for better or for worse, that humans can really adapt to anything. And I think that's certainly a strength, although kind of a scary strength when you think about it. But now with the vaccines and more people getting vaccinated, we're beginning to see that light at the end of the tunnel, that light kind of shimmering through the trees, if you will. And we're seeing that light, but for some of us, we may be hitting a bit of a pandemic wall. We may be really struggling with pandemic fatigue. This year has been hard, and it has taken a lot out of us. And so tonight, I just wanted to provide time and space for us to name what we have been living through the past year and couple of months, to name that, to name how we're doing now, what we're struggling with now, and how to care for ourselves as we keep moving forward in COVID and in life post-COVID. You know, contrary to what a lot of people think, we actually find the energy, the strength, the resilience to keep walking and leading and moving forward when we name our experience. A lot of us tend to think, you know, we just got to keep our head down, we just got to keep walking, not think about it, not feel it, keep soldiering on, and that's how we get through something like this. But in reality, it's kind of the opposite. I have been seeing clients through this entire time of COVID, and I have found it is really the most beneficial when we stop and we name our experience. We name what has been going on. We give ourselves permission to admit, to recognize, to acknowledge the struggle. You know, we have to remember that we cannot stuff, we cannot put a smile on it and add some optimism and positive thinking that this experience is requiring more of us. This experience is requiring a lot of us. And so why is that? Well, it's because it's different from anything we've ever lived through before. The past year has been the stuff of science fiction novels and movies. I don't think any of us ever dreamed that we would live through something like this, with literally kind of the world shutting down around us, not having access to things that we just think are so automatic in our lives. And so it's required a great deal from us. The experience has been collective. You know, a lot of things that happen around the world or happen to us often happen in certain areas or certain regions or pockets of the country or to individuals. And this is really the only thing that I can think of that has impacted everyone and everything. Everyone has been touched. Everyone and every place has been impacted. You know, when COVID was at its height, there was nowhere to escape to normalcy, if you will. And on top of that, there has not been a roadmap, right? There's no one that we've been able to ask, well, hey, you know, when you lived through the global pandemic of your day, what was it like? And what did you do? And how did you navigate this? There's no one to ask how to survive a global pandemic. Now, and we were just talking about this before we started this evening, but I am sure there are going to be a slew of books coming out about how to survive a pandemic, how to lead during a pandemic, how to pivot during a pandemic, how to parent during the pandemic. You know, those books are coming. The next pandemic, we will be prepared, folks. But this one, we didn't have a roadmap. We didn't have anyone to ask. We didn't have past protocols to follow. And so instead, we've just had to wait and we've had to learn as we go. And so I'd like to start by just naming a few things that we've been living through, and then we're going to look at ways that we can healthily cope, both in a big picture sense, but specifically where we are right now in the COVID journey. So the first reason why this has been such a uniquely challenging experience is because this feels hard because it is hard. This has felt hard because it has been hard. You know, if you have been struggling with anxiety, it's because this has been an anxiety inducing situation. It's not because you're weak. It's not because you're overly worrisome. It's not because you aren't coping. It's not because you aren't trusting. This is an anxiety inducing situation. So why exactly has this been so anxiety inducing? Well, what we have to remember is that change and uncertainty are hard for us. Even if you're the type of person that loves variety, that loves to mix it up, that likes change, that likes to live without a plan, that's still your plan. Being spontaneous is your plan, right? Being spontaneous, not having a plan, is how you gain some certainty. You know, and so we crave certainty. As human beings, we crave normal and comfort and security. Now, we might have different definitions for normal, comfort, and security, but we crave normal, comfort, and security. We crave certainty. Interestingly enough, at the beginning of 2020, I was doing some reading on how people deal with change. Little did I know how useful that reading would turn out to be. But I saw this quote: people would rather be unhappy than uncertain. And I have thought of that quote so often this year, and I've kind of chuckled to myself, and I thought, wow, well, we've gotten to be both in 2020. But you know, it's kind of a depressing thought. People would rather be unhappy than uncertain. But I think it's true. You know, how many times have you said, or have you heard someone else say, well, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't? How often do we choose something, even if we don't really want it? Even if we don't like it, even if we know it isn't good for us, how often do we choose something because the outcome is known, because it's comfortable, because it's certain? You see, our brains crave certainty. They crave certainty so much that they feel threatened when faced with an unknown. Our brains register uncertainty as a problem, as a mistake that needs to be fixed. Our brains register uncertainty as a tiger that's threatening us. And that is why we feel anxious when we're faced with change or uncertainty. That is why you will always feel anxious when faced with change and uncertainty, because our brain's one job is to keep us alive. Every organ in our body has a job, has a purpose, has a function. And our brain's one job is to keep us alive. And so the way that it does that is our brains are constantly assessing if we are being threatened, if we are in danger. And so when something happens to us or around us, our brains immediately go into assessment mode. Are we okay? Are we in danger? What do we need to do in order to survive? And basically, this is our fight or flight response. Essentially, our brains are always on the lookout for tigers. But the problem with this automatic response is that our brains do not understand degrees of danger. Danger is a very black and white thing for our brains. We're either okay or we are in danger. And so we have to teach our brains to slow down that automatic response, if you will. And so if our brain perceives a tiger, right? If our brain perceives that we are out of control of a situation, if our brain perceives uncertainty, if our brain perceives change, then it sends us into fight or flight mode. It sends us into that anxiety response. And so instantly, all these things start happening in our body. Our adrenaline starts pumping, right? Because we got to run from the tiger or we got to fight the tiger, right? Our muscles tighten. Again, we got to run from the tiger or we got to fight the tiger. We become hyper alert. Are there other tigers around? Are there other threats around, right? Our digestion stops. This is the one that I find so interesting. When we are in fight or flight response, our digestion stops because our body's trying to conserve energy to fight or to run. And so your brain doesn't think that the body needs to spend all this energy digesting that hamburger if you're about to be attacked by a tiger, right? We have increased breathing, increased perspiration, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. When we are in fight or flight mode, our cognition changes. This is another one that's really interesting. Our thinking literally changes when we are in fight or flight mode because our brain is focused on the threat. Our brain is focused on taking quick action. Our brain is not in the place to make long-term decisions, because if you're about to be attacked by a tiger, do you really need to plan out what you're going to do 3 weeks from now? So when we are in fight or flight mode, we struggle to make long-term decisions. We struggle to have focus. We struggle to remember things because, again, if you're about to be attacked by a tiger, do you really need to remember what you did last weekend? So, and I point all of this out to say, if you have been having trouble sleeping during COVID, there's good reason for that. You have a lot of adrenaline coursing through your veins right now. Your brain doesn't think you need to be asleep. Your brain thinks you need to be up, looking for more tigers, watching more news, trying to figure out, is there going to be more bad news and more crisis and more of this and more of that? If you have been having digestive issues during COVID, there is good reason for that. It's because your body is not digesting food as it normally does because it thinks you're under attack. And so it doesn't think it needs to waste that energy. If you have struggled to focus or remember things during COVID, and I know that has been something a lot of people have talked about, there's good reason for that. Your brain doesn't think you need to remember all of these things. Your brain doesn't think that you need to make all of these decisions because your brain thinks you're being attacked by a threat. The other thing about our anxiety is that it can manifest in different ways emotionally, if you will, our emotional response. Now, for some of us, when we feel anxious, it manifests very traditionally. You know, we have racing thoughts, we have butterflies in our stomach, we have those traditional signs of anxiety. anxiety. But for others of us, our anxiety can actually manifest in different ways, and we don't realize we're actually anxious. So, for example, for a lot of us, when we are anxious, how that comes out is we get frustrated. We get easily frustrated. We have a shorter temper. We get angry, but really we're feeling anxious. For some of us, we have decreased patience when we're actually anxious. We might overfunction, if you will, start micromanaging everything and everyone. We hyper focus on cleaning out cabinets or cleaning out closets and making sure that everyone in our house cleans out their closet. You know, if I can't control a global pandemic, I am going to control this closet, right? We overfunction. We also might underfunction, right? We struggle to make decisions. We almost feel paralyzed because we feel so overwhelmed. We don't take care of the things that we normally take care of or that we know we should take care of. For some of us, we may withdraw when we're feeling anxious, withdraw from social interactions, withdraw from our life, if you will. And so our anxiety, it's helpful for us to spend some time identifying how our anxiety manifests, because then if we know, oh gosh, I'm feeling really frustrated right now, this level of frustration often me is a signal that I'm actually anxious. Then we can kind of chase that rabbit a little bit. What am I actually feeling anxious about today? Let me dig into that. Let me share that with someone. So this feels hard because it has been hard. We have been anxious because it is anxiety inducing. The other thing about this experience that I think it's important to name, and especially right now, is that our surge capacity is depleted. You know, of all the things I have learned and read over this past year, the concept of surge capacity has been one of the most interesting and also the most helpful, you know, both for myself and in working with my clients on this. Surge capacity is a collection of adaptive systems, mental and physical, that we draw on for short-term survival in acutely stressful situations. So surge capacity is why at the beginning of COVID, we made all the color-coded schedules, right? There is no one with more hope in this world than somebody who's just made a color-coded schedule, y'all. Lots of hope in that color-coded schedule of how that is going to bring certainty and control to their life. Surge capacity is why we walked at specific times of the day at the beginning of COVID. It's why we cleaned out every closet. It's why we started all the DIY projects. It's why we baked all the bread, so to speak. Surge capacity is that rush of adrenaline to lift the car over our heads and save the women and the children, so to speak. But generally speaking, trauma and crisis are momentary events in our lives. They are relatively short-lived events that can have lingering effects. And since they are momentary, our surge capacity can renew. And it renews when the dust settles and we begin to emerge from the crisis. But this experience has been totally different from that. We are continuing to live in the crisis. I heard Brene Brown liken this experience to living through a hurricane. And as the hurricane is hitting the shore, you're trying to do relief and recovery efforts. The crisis is lingering with COVID. We are living in a prolonged state, if you will. And it seems like every week there has been a new crisis to come across our plate. And as a result, we aren't getting the chance to renew our surge capacity. The dust isn't settling. The dust just keeps swirling, right? There's been no break, no clearing of the clouds. And so now we are depleted. And so what does depleted surge capacity look like? Well, it looks like decreased focus, decreased concentration, a decrease in mental energy, decrease in patience and motivation. It looks like an increase in temper, in anger, attempts at control, apathy, anxiety, sadness, exhaustion, stress, and boredom. kind of just boredom in life. And that list kind of it really summarizes how a lot of people are feeling right now. So it's important to, if you are feeling a lack of motivation, if you are feeling an increase in your temper, if you are feeling just kind of apathetic and bored with life, it's important to recognize my surge capacity is depleted. There is a reason for this. It's not that just all of a sudden I have become lazy and disinterested in life. My surge capacity has been depleted. The other thing that I think is important to name about this experience with COVID is that we have been living in a year of consistent grief and trauma. Collectively, as a society, we have been through an enormous amount of trauma and grief. Trauma is defined as a distressing or disturbing event. And this past year has most definitely been distressing and disturbing. This has impacted us emotionally. It has impacted us physically, financially, relationally, and it is impacting us beyond our choice and beyond our control. It is traumatic to have lived as isolated as we have lived over this past year. You know, as human beings, we are wired for connection. We come out of the womb needing connection. And so to live isolated has impacted our physical and emotional well-being. In addition to all of that, we have been surrounded by loss, loss of life, loss of health, loss of jobs, loss of finances, loss of economic security, loss of freedom of movement, loss of plans, vacations, traditions, milestones, routines, schedules, loss of hugs, right? So many people have gone months and months and months without any physical contact, without a hug. We lost our normal. And everyone has lost something. And when we lose something, whether we recognize it or not, we experience grief. And, you know, grief is not something that we do well as a society. In fact, I think most of us would say, I have no idea how to grieve. And grief makes me feel very uncomfortable. We don't do grief well in our society. And so we oftentimes then don't understand when we are grieving. But, you know, that sadness that maybe you have felt over this past year that you can't quite pinpoint, that physical feeling you might get when you read articles that say, you know, life won't fully return to normal until 2022, that heaviness that maybe you have felt watching the news, that's grief. That is grief. The anger that maybe you have experienced this past year, that is grief. You know, this isn't the year we wanted. Maybe you wanted to celebrate a milestone in your life a different way, and you didn't get to do that. These weren't the holidays we wanted. Last summer wasn't the summer we wanted. None of this is what we have wanted. And, you know, maybe you are someone who it still has your job, but your job is totally different. And it's almost like you have a totally different job because it has changed so much. And maybe you feel kind of torn of, wow, I'm really thankful I have a job, but I don't like doing my job this way. There is just a lot of loss around us. For a lot of people, they report a lot of loss in their relationships. There has been an increase in conflict and tension in relationships, which has led to a lot of broken relationships. And so some of these things that we are grieving are tangible losses, and some of them are what we call ambiguous losses. And ambiguous loss can feel confusing because ambiguous loss, there's nothing we can really point to, right? There's nothing concrete. There's nothing that we can say that was there and now it's no longer there. But an ambiguous loss is still loss. There's still something missing that we expected to be there. And with ambiguous loss, it can feel hard to put into words how we're feeling. And so with ambiguous loss, we may even struggle to give ourselves permission to grieve the loss. We may think things like, oh, it wasn't that big of a deal, whatever, that I didn't get to do that. I should be grateful. I have my health, I have a job. And so I shouldn't even make a big deal that I didn't get to do that. But a loss is a loss. And we can say those sorts of things till the cows come home. But the reality is our brains register loss as loss. Our brains don't always rate and quantify loss. Pain and sadness are pain and sadness to our brains. The other aspect that has been traumatic for us is that we don't know what the finish line looks like. And we still don't really know what the finish line looks like. And we don't know where that is, right? And we also have to recognize we are wired for finish lines. Literally, our brains are wired for finish lines. They are wired for that reward system of completing something, of finishing something. We're wired to get that dopamine hit when we complete something. And so when we don't get that dopamine hit, when we don't know where that finish line is or when we're going to get it, it's really hard for our minds to conceptualize that and to figure out how to keep moving forward without a destination, if you will. And so all of this can lead to what some of us might be feeling right now, which is pandemic fatigue, or what I read last week in a very interesting New York Times article. They called it languishing. And as I read the article and as I thought to my clients and friends and people I've been speaking with, I thought, yes, languishing, that describes what a lot of people have been feeling and perhaps still are feeling. Languishing is that in-between phase. We aren't fully depressed, but we aren't functioning at our optimum level, if you will. We're in the in-between, we're a little low on motivation, we're a little tired, we feel a little blah. We can see the light at the end of the tunnel, but we don't have quite that same energy that we did in life pre-COVID. So how do we move from languishing to thriving? How do we learn to cross over that pandemic wall if we are finding ourselves right there? So I wanted to give you some strategies that we can apply to our lives right now, but really these first few things that I'm going to be talking about, we can apply to our lives anytime, but I think it's super important that we apply them now. And then I'm going to discuss some specific things that we may be facing right now in terms of reentry anxiety and what we can do if we are experiencing a bit of reentry anxiety. So first and foremost, we want to give ourselves a lot of permission. The best thing we can do for ourselves is to give ourselves a lot of permission and a lot of grace. The more patient you are with yourself, and this is the case pandemic or not, the more patient you are with yourself, the more patience you will have for others, the more understanding and self-compassion you have with yourself, for your slip-ups, for your forgetfulness, for your bad days, the more you will be able to pass that on to others. Again, remember, we are living in an existence that we've never lived in before. You shouldn't know how to do this, right? You shouldn't know how to come out of a pandemic. You've never done it before. And so the fact that you may feel a little iffy, a little unsure, it doesn't mean that you're doing something wrong. It means that you're doing something new, right? And so remembering that, I think, is very, very key. I think also recognizing that for a lot of us, our inner critics have been very active during COVID. Our inner critics have decided to take COVID as a real opportunity to just talk a lot and be very loud in the things that they say. Perhaps you have noticed your inner critic talking about how productive you're being, or how much you're eating, or how you're not doing this, or how you are doing that. Our inner critics have made us feel guilty for feeling frustrated, for feeling anxious, for feeling sad, for feeling happy, for doing okay when others are struggling, for not enjoying every minute of the constant family time over the past 14 months. It's important for us to identify our inner critic when it is shouting and to get very honest with ourselves about the expectations we are putting on ourselves right now. Are you expecting yourself to have a plan when there is still so much uncertainty about the next several months? Are you expecting yourself to be as productive as you were in life before COVID? Are your expectations realistic given the circumstances of your situation? When we are honest with ourselves about our expectations, we can then engage in more grace and patience for ourselves. And we can also begin to recalibrate our expectations. Again, remember, COVID is not a problem to solve. COVID is an experience to live through. And we want to remind ourselves that, you know what, we're doing better than we probably think that we are doing. And we always have tomorrow to try again. You have tomorrow to tweak some things. You have tomorrow to make amends. You have, if you lost your temper with someone, you have tomorrow to try again. The second thing that I think is really important right now in in coping for our mental health is developing emotional awareness and emotional curiosity. And really, this is important at any time, but it is especially important right now. Now is not the time to stuff our feelings. Now is not the time to stuff our feelings and not say anything. There is too much to keep inside. You have probably noticed you have been experiencing a lot of emotion over this past year. You know, maybe typically you're kind of a 1 to 5 emotional range person, and maybe you're experiencing the 464 color crayon box of emotions. We have been experiencing a lot of different emotions, a wider variety of emotions, probably a greater intensity of emotions. Maybe you have been experiencing quicker emotional changes, mood changes in your life. And all of that is normal. But for a lot of us, it probably feels really uncomfortable because for a lot of us, perhaps you are used to stuffing your emotions, or you're used to ignoring them by trying to stay busy or focusing on other things. But the thing about COVID is that we have not had access to our normal de-stressors, right? And a lot of our de-stressors were good things: going to the gym, spending time with friends. But those de-stressors, as much as they themselves weren't bad, they were escape routes. They were escape routes from ourselves. And the thing that COVID has done, COVID has taken a lot away, but COVID has given us back to ourselves, so to speak. COVID has given us the opportunity to really sit with ourselves and not escape ourselves, not escape those thoughts, not escape those feelings. And that can feel really uncomfortable, but it's actually been a good thing. So what do we do with all of these feelings? We get emotionally curious, because being emotionally curious is the pathway to emotion regulation. We want to regulate our emotions, not stuff them, not deny them. We want to regulate our feelings. So what does that actually look like? Well, first of all, we want to notice that we are reacting to something, that we're feeling something. We don't want to judge or criticize ourselves for the way that we're thinking, or how we reacted to something. We just want to be objectively curious. That really irritated me right then. I wonder what's going on there. Notice we ask ourselves, what's going on? What's going on there? What's going on with me? We don't ask ourselves, what's wrong with me? What's wrong with me that I just got irritated? And the reason we don't ask what's wrong with me is because that's a shaming question. Then we're just shaming ourselves for the way that we feel. And then that becomes a whole bigger mess that we have to deal with. So we want to ask ourselves, what's going on with me? That's a curiosity question. The other thing about being emotionally curious is that we're emotionally curious about ourselves, not the other person. And yes, it is much more interesting to wonder why Sally can't ever meet her deadlines.
I completely agree with you there, but it's not very productive to get curious about Sally. It is much more productive to get curious about ourselves. What is it about what's going on within me that I get so easily triggered by Sally, right? The curiosity is about ourselves. So, what does it sound like to be curious? Well, it sounds like this. Wow, everyone is annoying me today. I wonder what that's about. I keep replaying that conversation over and over and over again in my mind. I wonder what's going on there. I feel so angry, I want to cry or I want to throw something. I wonder what's going on with me. All I want to do is eat sweets today. I wonder what's going on with me. All I want to do is hide and go away. I wonder what's going on. We want to get curious and we want to identify how we are feeling. And we have to let ourselves admit how we're feeling, whether that's sad or mad or anxious and or deliriously happy. And we don't even know why we're deliriously happy, but we want to identify how we're feeling. And we want to identify that root feeling, not the surface, the surface knee-jerk feeling. We want to let that be a guide to dig deeper, but we want to identify that root feeling and we want to share that root feeling because stuffed feelings, unexpressed feelings become like a cancer in our souls. They grow and they morph and eventually they will come out. The thing that we have to remember about feelings is you get to choose how your feelings come out. You can choose to have them come out in a very productive way through journaling, sharing with a friend, sharing with a counselor, or you can choose to stuff them and eventually they'll come out in the form of panic or rage or heart problems or high blood pressure or an eating disorder or addiction, but feelings always come out. You may not be able to choose what triggers your emotions, but you can choose your emotional response. And so we want to get curious about our feelings, and then we want to use that curiosity to identify how we're feeling so that then we can pause, which keeps us from jumping into unproductive reactions. So, what is an unproductive reaction? An unproductive reaction is a reaction that feels good in the moment, but is not so great, not so productive in the long term. It's when we offload what we are feeling inside rather than identify what we're feeling and figure out what we need to do next in our lives. Unproductive reactions create tension-filled environments. They erode safety and trust in relationships. And just in general, they are very damaging for our personal and our professional relationships. And if you are caught in a cycle of unproductive reactions, you know that it is emotionally exhausting to be caught in that cycle of stuffing, exploding. Stuffing, exploding. But unfortunately, too many of us live that way. And so we want to learn to identify, ooh, I'm reacting to something. Ooh, what's the feeling? And then that pause. The pause is vital, especially when we are faced with a lot of change and uncertainty, because our brain is going to send us into that anxiety response. And we do have a tendency to overreact when we are in that anxiety response. So let me give you an example of what this all looks like in real life. So let's say that you have cleaned up the kitchen for the 100th time of the day. And you walk into the kitchen and someone has left a glass on the counter. And you see that glass and it's just like fire descends on you. You are just furious, I can't believe someone left a glass. I mean, you are ready to fight the tiger. Whoever left that glass, you are ready to destroy that tiger, right? So in that moment, you have a choice. You can lash out. You can offload all of that anger. You can tear into everyone around you about the glass. And that's going to feel good in the moment. It's not going to be productive long term. Or you can pause and you can go, all right now I'm furious. Right now I am angry. I am frustrated. What do I know about anger? Well, what we know about anger is that anger is a secondary emotion, which means that there is always something underneath anger. So anger is the surface emotion, and there are always root feelings under anger. And the three root feelings that are usually under anger are sadness, hurt, fear, anxiety, and shame, insecurity. And so to pause and go, oh, I'm so furious right now. I'm so angry right now. But I know that anger is a secondary emotion. So what is actually under my anger? What am I actually feeling right now? I think I'm feeling anxious. And so you identify, I think I'm feeling anxious. What am I feeling anxious about? And that is the feeling that then you go and share with somebody. Hey, when I walked into the kitchen and I saw the glass, I was really angry. But what I recognize now is that I'm feeling really anxious. I'm feeling over COVID. I'm anxious about the vaccine. I'm anxious about reentry. And that's what we want to share. And that's how we build connection. That's how we build safe environments around us. If we can practice emotional curiosity, identify and understand our feelings, then we can share our feelings and choose our actions. And this creates a safer, less chaotic environment for those around us, but it also keeps us off the emotional roller coaster. The other thing of these three things that are kind of big picture mental health coping skills is that we want to tune into our thinking. Just like we want to be emotionally curious, we want to be curious about our thinking, because for a lot of us, we just kind of think on autopilot. We're not always aware of our exact thinking because our thinking is just kind of like white noise, it's just it's just back there. But we want to begin to tune into our thinking so that we can hear those specific thoughts that we are having. Because especially when we are feeling anxious, one of the unfortunate things that our minds do is that when we're already feeling anxious, our minds tend to hyper focus on the negative. And the reason that our minds do this is it's actually part of our survival response. If we're already feeling threatened, let me look for more dangers, let me look for more negatives that might threaten me further so I can figure out how to survive them. And so we want to be really intentional when we are feeling anxious about tuning into that thinking so we can capture those thoughts, those negative thoughts, and replace them with truth-based thoughts. And one of the ways that we can become more aware of these thoughts is to recognize that our negative thinking often follows a pattern. And if we can recognize that pattern, it's easier to go, oh, yeah, okay, I'm doing that. Let me look for some truth in here. And so I just wanted to give you a few examples of some negative thinking patterns that are very common. All or nothing thinking, this is probably the most common of them all. This is when we tend to think in extremes, black or white, yes or no, good, bad, all or nothing. When we fall into this negative thinking pattern, it usually leaves us feeling trapped, feeling helpless, like we don't have a choice. I either stay in this job until the rest of my life or I'm homeless on the street. And it's like, oh, there are like 14 million options between those two things there. And so how do we dial back all or nothing thinking? We begin to look for the middle ground. And I know that's easier said than done, but we begin to look for the middle ground. We begin to observe our situation more objectively rather than with those hot feelings. And we really force ourselves to look for the options. Catastrophizing is another very common one. We assume the worst, we focus on the negative, we discount any positive thing that might have happened, and we just focus on that negative. Obviously, this catastrophizing steals our joy. Obviously, it ratchets up our anxiety. When we recognize that we are catastrophizing, we want to practice looking for the positive. We don't want to fall into that toxic positivity, but we want to celebrate what the good that is going on in our situation. We want to identify what we can control. Too often we try to control the things that are outside of our control, and we don't spend enough time controlling the things that we can actually control. We want to remind ourselves that even though we are so confident that we know everything, we actually don't know the end of the story. We may say, I know it's going to be this, this, and this, and this, but we really don't. We don't know the end of the story. Shoulding is a very common one, living under the tyranny of I should, I must, I ought to. This line of thinking, this should thinking, is often linked to a sense of duty or obligation, which we then feel resentful of whatever we feel obligated to. And so to begin to walk back from that shoulding, we want to recognize that resentment is a very powerful emotion and it's a very loud messenger. And when we're feeling resentful, it's often an indicator that we are people pleasing or over accommodating somewhere in our lives, that we're not having good boundaries. And so begin to look at that. We want to remember with the shoulding that our lives don't have to look like everybody else's. You know, I actually don't have to live the way that my family lives or my neighbors live. I can choose to live a different way. Just begin to really identify that tyranny of the should. And then the last one, overgeneralizing. Overgeneralizing is when we believe that a negative experience is going to repeat itself. So just because in middle school someone got mad at you and stopped talking to you, you now believe that all friends can't be trusted and you hold everyone at arm's length. And so you take one incident and you apply it to everything after that. And so how do we walk back from overgeneralizing? We want to learn to ask ourselves, do I know for sure this will happen, or am I afraid this will happen? And again, that's getting into that emotional curiosity and identifying that feeling. We want to recognize when we are mind reading someone, you know, oh, I know they're thinking this about me and I know they're doing this. Again, do you really know? Are you mind reading? We want to identify those root feelings, those root fears. And so those are just some examples of negative thought patterns that we can look for that can signal to us that we're falling into some negative thinking. And so just in general, those are three things that I think we can always apply to safeguard our mental health and our emotional health. But now, and I recognize we're running out of time. But I did just want to pivot for a second and talk specifically about things that we can do as we begin to return to normal. I've had a lot of clients recently start talking about reentry anxiety, and reentry anxiety is a real thing. And as the world is returning to normal as much as we can, you may find that you are feeling a little sad. You may find that you're feeling a little frustrated, a little anxious. And I want you to know that that is normal. And that's normal because we're on the cusp of another change. And remember what we said, that we're always going to feel anxious when we're facing change and uncertainty. And so, you know, for you, maybe you've enjoyed not having a commute and you've enjoyed having longer evenings, and the thought of sitting in your car an hour and a half every day just makes you feel so sad. Maybe you've enjoyed being able to see your kids in the afternoon, and the thought of not seeing them until later in the evening makes you feel sad. Maybe you've enjoyed the extra coverage at home with your partner working from home. Maybe you've enjoyed having less things on your calendar and being able to spend more time at home and not having to think of an excuse to tell somebody no. Maybe you've enjoyed having a smaller circle of friends to keep up with. You know, we have to remember that as life returns to normal, you don't have to return to that life you had before COVID. COVID has been life-changing. And so let it change your life. If there are things that you liked in COVID, figure out how you can keep those things in your life post-COVID. And so I think that's important to decipher. You know, I'm having some anxiety. What are some things that I actually liked about COVID living that I can hold on to? The other thing when it comes to our reentry anxiety is that I think it's helpful to decipher what is going on with my reentry anxiety. Am I having COVID anxiety, or am I having social anxiety? And if we can decipher between those two types of anxiety, it lets us know what we need to do next. So just for instance, COVID anxiety, if you have had prior health anxiety, you are going to be much more prone to COVID anxiety. If you have COVID anxiety, you're going to do a lot of checking the numbers, checking to see what the governor said, checking to see what this state is doing. You may have repeatedly searched the internet for, you know, well, what's the CDC saying? What's this person saying? What can we do here? What can we not do? You may, if you're experiencing COVID anxiety, you may have experienced an increase in areas that feel unsafe, like more and more areas are feeling unsafe rather than fewer, less and less. You may engage in a lot of reassurance seeking. Well, what are you doing? Are you eating in restaurants now? Kind of checking in with other people. A big sign that I've noticed with COVID anxiety is that people have a lot of rules for what they feel is safe, but those rules aren't always consistent. And so inconsistent rules, that's a big sign of COVID anxiety. Or you may be experiencing social anxiety. You may feel easily overstimulated being around people. You may feel anxious or nervous about being around more than just a handful of people. You may feel nervous about not knowing what to talk about. I mean, y'all, we haven't small talked in over a year. We're out of shape, right? You just may have a low social energy, low desire to be around people. But it's helpful to decipher, okay, my reentry anxiety, is it COVID anxiety? Is it social anxiety? Because again, it lets us know what we need to do next. If we're experiencing COVID anxiety, a couple of things that you can do: you have to decrease the checking. You actually don't need to know the numbers. And I know that's a hard thing to give up, but you don't need to know the numbers as well as Dr. Fauci does. You don't. And the checking just reinforces the anxiety. You also want to decrease your reassurance seeking behaviors, asking friends what they're doing, reading articles. You want to play out the tape. What am I afraid will happen? All right, well, then what then? Okay, well, then what then? And you have to remember, nothing is ever going to be 100% certain. And we'll talk about that in just a second. You also want to get honest about the inconsistency with your rules. And the reason I say that is because if we can get honest about the inconsistency with our rules, then we can usually find that loophole where we can begin to take small steps to widen our circle, to widen our comfort zone. Whether it's COVID anxiety, social anxiety, or anxiety about whatever it is, the only way we fight anxiety is to widen the comfort zone. Begin to take those small steps to widen that comfort zone. If you're having social anxiety, then you might want to remember that, we all have a social muscle, a tolerance, a stamina for being around people, for talking, for stimulation. And just like any muscle, when it isn't used, it atrophies. And we haven't used our social muscle in a year. And so our social muscle has atrophied. And so it's going to take a little bit of time to build that social muscle up. So start small. Start with seeing small groups of people outside. Start with seeing one or two people inside. Again, returning to normal doesn't mean you have to return to your life as it was before COVID. You can create the life after COVID that works for you based on what you learned about yourself during COVID. A couple of other things about reentry anxiety, and then we will wrap up. 100% certainty and 100% anxiety free are not realistic goals. If you are waiting to feel 100% certain before you do certain things, you are going to wait a long time, because when we wait to feel 100% anxiety free about anything, when we wait for 100% certainty about anything, what happens is that the line keeps getting pushed farther and farther out. And when that happens, our comfort zone gets smaller and smaller. Our world gets smaller and smaller. We want to set small, achievable goals for ourselves. Set yourself up for success. Give your mind a win. If you are experiencing anxiety right now about doing certain things, I encourage you to make a hierarchy. What is the thing that you are the most anxious about doing? Put that at the top, and then kind of walk down from there to the thing that I think about it, but I don't really have a lot of anxiety. And then begin to walk up the hierarchy, if you will. Start with those small steps to give yourself a win. Again, set yourself up for success, but you want to baby step your way to a different mindset. Baby step your way to expanding that comfort zone. And then the last two things when it comes to reentry anxiety: learn to do something new. Learn something new, do something new. Pandemic living has been very mundane. And so our minds have not received the typical amount of stimulation that they do with newness and activity. And so learning or doing something new awakens our minds. And learning or doing something new is one of the best things that you can do when you are languishing, when you're struggling with depression or struggling with anxiety, because it gives you something to focus on. And again, it expands that comfort zone. And then lastly, move. Walking and yoga, those two things specifically are the best things that you can do when you're feeling anxious and when you're feeling down, because it releases a lot of adrenaline and it gets our bodies moving and our minds moving in a positive way. There's a great deal that is still out of our control right now, but we can control how we care for our mental, emotional, and relational health. And this, by caring for our mental health, that is how we face uncertainty, whether it is a pandemic or any other uncertainty in our lives. And that's how we survive challenging experiences. So thank you so much for your time tonight. I see there are several questions in the chat box. And so if it's okay with y'all, I'm just going to scroll through them here and begin to answer them. Okay, is there a rise in alcoholism due to COVID? Yes, there has been a significant rise in drinking, alcohol intake. Liquor stores are doing great. Wineries, I probably shouldn't have made a joke about that, but yes, you see that in the market that alcohol sales have significantly increased compared to 2019 sales, but you're also seeing an increase. I read an article a couple of months ago that doctors were seeing an increase in liver damage, particularly in young adult women, that young adult women have been drinking a lot more than they did before COVID. And it is due to the stress and the anxiety, the stuffing of the feelings, the escaping. And so, yes, there has been an increase in drug and alcohol use. What is toxic positivity? Great question. As I said that phrase, I was like, oh gosh, I'm not explaining what that means. And not everybody might understand what that means. Toxic positivity is when we like ruthlessly pursue positive thinking. You know, the world could be burning down around us and like, it's all good. I have a fire to keep me warm, you know, and it's when we almost deny reality because we are so tunnel visioned on silver lining thinking, on thinking positively, and it can become toxic because there can be a denial factor to it. And it is important to acknowledge when bad things are happening. You know, resilience is, we've heard so much about resilience. Resilience is not positive thinking. Resilience is not being optimistic. In actuality, resilience, we become resilient when we are able to name the bad and the good in our lives. And more specifically, when we are able to name the bad and still hold on to hope. Toxic positivity is when we just insist on only seeing the good and we deny the reality of the struggle around us. Let me see. Oh yes, this is a big one. Do you have any tips on how to deal with COVID fatigue and working from home with children at home? Yes, and that is one of the things that makes this experience of COVID so unique compared to other things we've experienced in history. The working from home, having children at home, the virtual learning. This is a situation where, and I'm not saying this to blow off the question, but having the mindset of we are all doing the best that we can. And every day isn't going to be great. And some days might be okay. And some days might be mediocre. But I think really lowering those expectations, you aren't going to be as productive as you were before COVID. You probably aren't even going to be as productive as you were before COVID when your kids return to school or daycare, because there's going to be some time for you to recover from the trauma of what you have lived through, of being responsible for so much and having to handle so much. So I think really lowering expectations, That helps us have more patience for ourselves. That helps us have more patience for our children. Um, I think is very important, where you can and when you can, to schedule some away time or some downtime. One of the things that I've been telling clients is, and I really focused on this over the summer, this past summer, is that it's important to have something to look forward to. We can do anything as human beings if we have something to look forward to. It's the finish line complex, it's the reward complex. And so if you know that on Saturday, I'm going to have a couple of hours to be by myself, or even just to go run errands by myself, I'm going to have a couple of hours out of the home, that can help you get through the week. And so to have something to look forward to each week, to have days of the week, and that might be a day in the middle of the week or days on the weekend that are different from the rest of the days of the week. That's been part of the strenuousness of this experience, is that every day's been the same, particularly if you're working from home and your kids have been virtual learning. There's been no distinction, and we're kind of wired for a 5-day work week and then the weekend, and we haven't even had that in COVID. And so trying to make those weekends different in some way so that your mind and your body feel that shift in the schedule, I think is really important. Having something to look forward to. And I think also, if you find yourself really struggling with feeling down, your anxiety is increasing, to talk with someone. And I'm not saying that just because I'm a therapist, but to have somewhere outside of your home that you can vent and process the stress that you are feeling is very, very important. Again, now is not the time to stuff our feelings. And therapy is really accessible right now because everybody is online. And so you don't have to leave your home. Let me see. I'm reading the next one. Yes. So feeling more anxious now than you did perhaps during the high point of the pandemic, and feeling that regret of, why didn't I clean out the closets? Why didn't I seize the opportunity more? Why didn't I get those papers organized? Yes. And I think that is, I think that's a common feeling with folks. And I think that tendency towards regret can be one that really plagues us, of, oh, I didn't seize the moment enough, or did I really enjoy my whole family being home enough? Did we play enough board games? And really what regret is it's our inner critic. And it's important to recognize that regret is our inner critic disguised. And it's our inner critic figuring out a sneaky way to criticize how we've been living and what we're doing now. And again, recognizing this is my inner critic, and my inner critic's just trying to beat me up. And our inner critics are rarely based in truth. Our inner critics are often based in fear and old wounds. And so recognizing that's my inner critic, that's not truth. I did the very best that I could during COVID, and I did what I needed to do to move through COVID. Some people needed to clean out closets and bake bread, and some people didn't. But more importantly, to recognize that regret is actually your inner critic.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. It's been very comforting to hear that everything that we've been feeling this past year is normal, and that we're all learning how to navigate our mental health during this really difficult time. So I really want to thank you for the coping techniques that you talked about. I know I'm definitely going to practice some of those, give myself some permission. So thank you so much. I want to thank everyone for attending tonight, and we really hope that this was beneficial to you. Thank you again, Maisie, and thank you so much, everyone, and we hope that you have a good night.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good night. Bye-bye.
Bye.